Oh,
both of
okay,
us.
little babies. For some
So
reason, I thought your kids were. I guess because you and Joanna have been together so long. I just assumed your kids were older.
you were the first person to have that response because usually my friends hear how old they are and then suddenly like have an existential crisis and reenact the inferno
They haven't had kids yet.
because they
Or,
haven't
or
had a kid yet. That's the real reason. Yeah, they haven't had
but
a
I
kid.
mean, surely we are getting to the age where, like, if you haven't had them, like,
But you
you gotta
probably
have
yeah
them.
you're probably not going. I mean, and that is increasingly common. Like I'm never yeah I've never been a hard sell guy. Like if you don't want to have kids, I won't try to persuade you to have kids.
I
Uh,
fully understand not having kids.
yeah,
Like, if Rachel had come, I would not particularly did not particularly want to have a child.
yeah,
If Rachel had come to me and been like, "I've changed my mind, don't want to have a child," I'd be like, "Great!" So I just get to do whatever I want every single day for the rest of my life.
right,
That's great.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's. I think I would. I think I would have. I won't say I would have been happy without kids because I'm not happy now. I never would have been happy regardless. I'm a writer, but like I wouldn't have opted to have kids. But I'm very like I'm very glad it happened. It feels like a lot of my life is like I wouldn't have planned this, but like I'm not very good at planning things. So what do I know?
I mean, at some point, I realized when I started dating women, especially, I was like, you know, most of these women want to have children.
It's a thing one notices about women when one dates them.
So, like if you really don't want to have a child, then you gotta like scream aggressively at the beginning.
Yeah,
And
scream aggressively, but yeah. And spoiler alert, it often doesn't work.
that's true because they change their minds. There does come to be a moment. Oh
Which
wow.
is yeah, which is probably why it's good that at least some of us are not very good at life. Well, you seem better at life planning than I am, but I was not like the people who are like envision your life in 5 years. It was always like I can maybe envision what I might be want to be working on or what I would want to be reading, but I have no idea what my life will look like.
Oh no, no. I feel like if you find someone that you can envision spending your life with,
Yeah.
then like that's like you gotta, as long as they're not like a drug addict or like don't have some terrible deal breaker, then that's the horse to bet on.
I was just reading Tolstoy's complaint about art and how almost all art is terrible, and he was like, they're all novels. They're just about adultery, 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 adultery. Novelists don't want to write about anything else, and like he's not totally wrong about that. Like I will say, I have come to feel less understanding for people who leave their spouses for like fall in love and move in with somebody new. I
So
can understand
foolish.
being attracted to somebody else. I can't understand like being willing to like tolerate somebody. Like it's most people are so terrible. And like when you find somebody you want to live with, it's like, can you imagine having to live with a different woman? It'd be terrible.
Oh, I know it'd be so bad. Oh my gosh. So you read What is Art?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, do you
Yeah.
know it? I
I'm
just
very
yeah.
fond of What is Art. I read What is Art in the airport. I want to say in Delhi, well, however many years ago.
Yeah.
And I was 100% convinced. I was like, oh man, for at least like 12 hours, I was 100% convinced. I was like, this guy has it all figured out. He understands art completely.
So like yeah, like I definitely don't agree with his conclusions, but I agree with almost all of his arguments on the way to his conclusions, right?
Yeah.
Like I still want to keep all the guys he wants to throw out and I don't want to just like only listen to Christian folk songs, but like all of his criticisms of contemporary art seem like pretty dead on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like, but like, like, he hated like ballet, like opera.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he hated his own novels. In What is Art? He's like,
Yeah.
my own novels
Yeah,
are
yeah, yeah.
immoral. I was like, this seems a little suspect. Like, I mean,
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, what he does say with a lot of it is that it's immoral, but I love. Like he's like, I love all these guys, but I'm wrong to love them, right? Which feels to me like that feels very familiar. So
it's true. I mean, and he also really wanted to be close. Like, I mean, he wanted to be close to the peasants.
yeah,
So he's like, the peasants. My art is not for the peasants, so it's bad.
it just feels like you got like on your like 15th season of like Harvest Mystery plays, you just be like, I could really use some Chekhov. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This week I am speaking with Naomi Kanakia, the author of the very popular blog Woman of Letters, which is a Substack blog about great books, about her experience reading great books, as well as some thoughts about literary culture and academic culture in general. She is not, as you will hear, an academic, but she has a lot of experience in the academy and an enormous amount of experience with books. She has truly read everything. I mean, as you already heard in the cold open, I can't imagine there's a book I've read that she has not read, and certainly anything that happened to come up in the course of the conversation she was very familiar with. She reads very, very quickly and very prolifically, and with great and for pleasure. I mean, she's a big believer in reading for pleasure. We talk about that, about her, fairly provocative thesis about English class, literary criticism, and the teaching of literary criticism specifically. And then in the second part, which will be up on The Secret Show in the next day or so, we talk a little bit more about books. We also talk some about a kind of an interesting question dealing with politics and culture, war, conflict, and literature, and how lines and sides don't always work out the way one might imagine. She has some extremely nuanced views on all of these questions. And as with the Alan Shapiro episode, I will be surprised if you do not hear something you disagree with. She makes a point of saying that she's pretty sure that most of her followers on the blog would probably strongly disagree with a lot of her politics. I can relate, but I think we are both we're both just interested in continuing to have good conversations with thoughtful people. So I hope you will enjoy that. Very quickly, first, I have to plug a few things. One, and maybe most significantly, the new issue of Literary Matters is out. It is the first full issue completely under the editorship of Matt Steinhoffel, who's really done an extraordinary job. He's taken over from Ryan and not at all tried to replicate what Ryan did, but run things in his own way. Cameron and I worked very hard along with Caitlin Doyle, Chris Childers, Jeff Peters, and Alexis Sears to put the issue together, and I think it came out pretty well. So that is out. I'm proud of that, but I'm impressed with Matt and Cameron and everybody else. I also have a little poem out in First Things. It's a poem that was written on demand after 5 tries, 5 false starts for Elijah's podcast, Versecraft. I read it on there along with poems by Alice and Elijah and Cameron a little while back. It's called Letter to a Middle-Aged Poet, and it's more or less as advertised. I'll put a link to that. And then finally, I will be in Los Angeles for AWP, along with my lovely and talented wife, Joanna, coming up in just a couple of weeks now. So I do hope to see some of you there. I'll be at the 32 Poems reading. I think Nita Sofa Saroon, who had the poem that I wrote about a little bit ago, she's going to be there. I'm hoping, Chris Childers lives there along with Sanaz, and whether or not he goes to the conference, I'm hoping we'll see him, see the Smarter Space people, and I think Alexis. Well, Alexis lives at I don't know if Alexis is going to be. I think she should be there. Be there, Alexis. Come on. And I hope a lot of other people. I'm looking forward to it. Not less because of the conference, which we might only barely go to at all, than because of all the people and things there that are worth seeing. Excited to see the museum. Really excited to do even any boring task, just as the 2 adult humans, sans dependent responsibilities, whom we love and cherish, of course. All right, so enough preamble. Here is my conversation with Naomi Kanakia, author of Woman of Letters and the upcoming but not yet available for pre-order book, What's So Great About the Great Books?
There's no cover. It's no pre-order link yet. It is done with Princeton Press. So Princeton Press, all their books, even the books that are like trade books for general audience, go through peer review. So it's wild. So we just got back the peer reviews, which were favorable. And
Okay.
now it has to go back to the editorial board and they have to approve that they actually are going to publish the book, which I imagine they will. And then I have to do some revisions and then, it'll go into production.
Peer review in this case being English professors, being what?
Yeah, basically three English professors.
Which is like a in the case like because you at least sort of in an offhand way say that like this book is sort of an argument for reading in a non-academic fashion. So it feels like that's
Yes, well, I
totally the
wrote that.
wrong.
I did write that after the peer reviews came back.
Ah,
So
okay, all
I
right.
was not going to write that before the peer review.
Right. Okay. All right. So good. I'm glad you passed peer
I
review.
definitely feel a lot less restrained now that the peer reviews have come back. Because at least one of the peer reviewers had definitely read my Substack. So I was like, I was correct that
Oh,
I should be careful.
so you had a post recently on your Substack called "Is Literary Criticism Just a School of Sophistry?" which I found like fascinating. I agreed with a ton of it. I had questions about a lot of it, and then you very quickly followed up with you had again like this is the advantage of reading very quickly. You had a reader say like, "Oh, but you should read John Guillory's new book on close reading," and then you immediately read it and then immediately wrote a response to it, which is very smart. And like it sounds like you are a fan of his, and it's a good book. But
Big
you
chunky
sort
fan.
of I won't say you double down, but like you like clarified and emphasized your original argument sort of against an academic style of reading. Basically, you said like literary professors should mostly be doing research and not be doing teaching because they're doing good with their research and bad with their teaching. And then you had one more essay that I at least wanted to maybe briefly touch on called "Is Literature a False God?" which was sort of a like an interesting complicated essay. And you do these things. I have because I like follow all these different people, and I don't always get the rhythm of every individual Substack. You have a trope you frequently use where you will speak in the third person in a semi autobiographical fashion, sometimes diverging from autobiography to say like let me tell you a story about a young reader named Johanna or something like this. So is that I'm just reading that as like a trope you use sometimes in your essays. Is that so? Because you also refer to having tales, but I don't know that
Yeah,
I've
those are
keyed in
basically
enough.
my tales. Auto
Okay,
fiction. It's basically auto fiction. I was writing a lot of stories in that style, like fictional stories. And then I was like, oh, it's going to be hard to sell these to journals. And so I started putting them on Substack, and then now I've done a bunch in a wide variety of styles. But the ones that tend to, like resonate the most with my readers are the ones that are about writers, readers.
yeah, I mean it's a very engrossing mode to write in. And it sort of feels like it's maybe like I think of like the very beginning of the unbearable lightness of being, where there's sort of like the characters are like half characters and half like rhetorical devices. It's an extremely readable Substack in both kind of critical and narrative modes. Your argument about literary criticism, and it is like a very Socratic tone you strike that I kind of appreciated. Like you have you say like we are teaching students to do a good job arguing lies. And we should instead teach them to do a good job arguing truths. And you maybe have uh, a less prescriptive or like transcendent definition of truth than Socrates might have. But yeah, what do you mean by literary criticism being instruction in telling lies?
Well, okay, so my understanding, at one point, I read this Edmund Husserl book. God, I can't even remember the title. The second half of the title is Crisis of the European Sciences. And Husserl basically was like, we think of science as giving us truth, but really, what gives us what we have the basic truth that we have access to is our own perceptions.
Yeah.
That is absolute truth, is our own perceptions. And so really like had me thinking differently about just like the idea of truth and like what we do in the humanities. And I think, close reading and like various forms of like reading in the humanities aim to capture that truth, the experience behind reading, and make it explicable to other people. So, and I think it's valuable to, as John Guillory put it in his book on close reading, to put pressure on the act of reading, so you can show other people what happens when you read a text. But when you teach it in school, in interpretation, you're not really teaching people to be honest about their own experience of reading books. You're teaching them to say something that is going to sound smart to you, the professor, right? Like, if an undergraduate who's not necessarily a very sophisticated reader was to be truly honest about their experience of reading, a book, like it would be pretty basic, right? Like they would like their experience, that you'd be lucky if they really were able to explicate the surface meaning of the text, you know?
Oh yeah.
Like if they are able to like actually describe on a literal level what is happening in a sentence and like what is happening in a scene, like I'm rereading Moby Dick right now. And at the beginning of Moby Dick, there's a part where he walks into the Spouter Inn and is trying to describe what is happening on a painting in the Spouter Inn. If an undergraduate was able to like look at that and just be like, Ishmael is looking at a painting and trying to tell you what is in this painting, that you should be happy. Like you should be
Yeah, yeah,
happy with
yeah,
that
yeah.
level of understanding. But if you ask the undergraduate to like go any deeper than that, you're kind of asking them to lie to you. Like I think like
Yeah,
they're at a
yeah,
level where they're really struggling to just understand the basic what's going on. If
yeah.
like it is, and like I do think that now myself reading that scene, which is it's a very smudged picture, smudged, smoky picture, and he can't figure out what it is, and he starts asking a bunch of people what it is, and they decide that it's about a ship that is being wrecked, and a whale is leaping over it and is about to spear itself on the three masts of the ship. I'm like, okay, that's like foreshadowing of what'll happen later in the book. That's something I like understand, but
Right. Yeah,
like,
yeah.
is that like really what the undergraduate understands? So, like, in the moment of them reading this, are they real? Is that really how they perceive it? So I think like the way it gets taught is like there's so much pressure to like have some sort of smart thoughts about
Yeah,
this
yeah,
book,
yeah.
and then you like kind of start to think like, oh, like if I can't have these smart thoughts about the book, then I'm not reading correctly.
Right. The comparison that just came to mind that I never thought of is Pentecostalism. Like I used to be a believing Catholic Christian, and like even at my most faithful, devout, when I like had an understanding of the Pentecost, which was that the Holy Spirit came down and spoke through the apostles, and they were able to speak in all these different languages so that people present could understand them. I like even at my most devout, I found it very like obnoxious and offensive the way Pentecostals use that story today to perform speaking in tongues as doing gibberish, as doing blah, 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 blah. And what you're like, the suggestion is almost like you could imagine being raised in a culture where you say like somebody does this and everybody treats him with reverence, and you can start to not just perform that but convince yourself that somehow what you're doing is in a way true or is connecting. That like I do feel sort of moved to make these gibberish sounds with my mouth. That your suggestion is basically like literary criticism is maybe like a highbrow version of that.
Yeah, like I wrote a review recently of James Percival Everett's novel,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
Metropolitan View is this new review I've.
yeah, and I didn't. I felt like the novel's aims were like a little trite, like to imagine that the character James, like to allow the character James or Jim from Huckleberry Finn to have some depth and to speak for himself. Like I felt like the novel didn't achieve its aims well. And a friend of mine, messaged me and was like, "You don't understand what this novel is about. You don't get it." And I'm like, "Okay, then I don't get it." But they kept being like, "Oh, like you don't get it. You don't get what it is." I'm like, "Yes, I don't get like if what like if I then I don't get it." Like, and
Yeah.
I'm like, but I can't write a review where I say that I get something. Like to the extent that I get it, I don't think it's good. And if there's a level on which it's good, then I don't get that. And like I can't
Yeah,
pretend
yeah,
to get something that I don't get.
right. Yeah, like you sort of you offer there are a couple possibilities for what it could possibly mean to say a text has a deeper meaning. Like one thing it could mean is like, oh, when I read this, I experience this other thing. And so that is for you a deeper meaning in some sense of the book. Another meaning would be like, well, if the author intended for something else to come across, whether or not he succeeds, that is at least in some sense a deeper meaning. But if there is something that a critic is drawing out of a text that most readers don't encounter, that the author didn't intend, maybe he can make an interesting argument about it. But like, in what sense is that a deeper meaning? Is like, in what sense is it even true to say that this is a thing that is in the book, or
Yeah,
this
I
is
mean, you
what the
have to
book means?
trust that that is the meaning that the critic sees, like that is genuinely what they experience.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Like, like whether you see meaning in like what they see is another thing. But mostly, it's like teaching people to do that is not good. You know,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. The do you know the little Sontag essay against interpretation?
yeah,
Yeah, which I mean, it came to mind reading your essay, and like her suggestion is that part of what, because I know like the tradition is like hermeneutics comes from study of the Bible, but her suggestion
definitely.
is that like interpretation, as she understands it, originates with readers looking back at mythological texts at a time when they no longer believe in those gods and trying to say, okay, well, we have these texts and they are significant, but we can't take them at face value anymore. So we have to take something else from them. That basically interpretation is a way of like reconciling the old to the new worldview. And I mean,
Yeah,
I do think like even when we like interpret in a hostile way today, often like we'll look at all of the bad meanings that are in this text. It is still a way of kind of reconciling the old with the new.
yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. And then also there's like, there's Freudianism and like the whole idea of psychology, which kind of allows us a layer where we can be like, oh, these symbols have some sort of unconscious meaning that represent something in our psyche. Well,
Yeah, which I mean, like I love Freud, but that feels to me like a very poor use of his good writing. Like he's a brilliant, bizarre reader, well, reader and writer, but I don't see like yeah, I never read his books and think like, oh, a secret truth has been revealed that now experts should explain. That's never my response to his
I mean,
books.
also Freud is at his worst when he does that. Oh my, like, did you ever read The Wolf Man?
The Wolfman?
The Wolf Man, the case of the Wolf Man.
No.
Uh, in Freud. So it's this case where like there's this boy who comes to him who's neurotic for various reasons, and this boy has this recurring dream of something to do with a wolf. I forget what exactly it is. And Freud interprets this dream as basically being like when you were 4 years old, you saw your parents having sex. And that is like the source of your difficulties. He does give himself an out. He's like, maybe it's not that you literally saw them having sex, and then your mom told you that your penis would fall off or whatever. Maybe you just thought that that's what happened, or you imagined that.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm like, yeah, like what's crazy is with Freud, you read stuff like the id, ego, super ego, like many of his explanations for behavior, like it seems so true, and then like he'll like kind of go into like this like interpretation of symbols. You're like, this feels ippier.
Yeah, yeah. When he tries to be a doctor is when he's like least reliable. But it's funny, like you're like you make the point, or you cite Gilry's point, and this is maybe in the follow up essay that close reading as a term was coined by people using it in order to attack the new critics, calling what they did close reading. But then he kind of makes the claim that basically what close reading is as you said, showing your showing your work as a reader, saying like, here is what happens when I read this text. And I think that is how like that's how I read a lot of Freud, is like he is giving a very vivid account of his experience reading either a text or a dream or whatever. And like it's great.
Yeah,
Like it's like, wow, that's an amazing way to read. It's not how I read. It's not how I think necessarily the author, but like what a cool way to read. I'm glad I know that now.
I agree. I
So,
agree with that.
your case, and maybe where I slightly resist some of your argument, is in the suggestion that like, or not the suggestion, but like the insistence that like usually when we try to do close reading with like ordinary kids who are not specializing in this, who are not looking to become English professors, who are not looking to become English teachers, ordinary kids, ordinary even like young adults, teaching them to close read or sort of teaching them to pretend to close read is a waste of time and is often sort of damaging. And it definitely seems like it can be damaging. You could, like you say, basically that like English class is a very good advertisement for not reading the books taught in English class, which I think is too often true. Totally true of poetry. Like nothing is good at scaring people off poetry like an English class. The place where I think like there may be some, I find some value in close reading in a kind of an instructional context. By the way, I was also like I dropped out of the English major and found like I'm not in the academy and I feel like I would never fit in very well there. But I do think that like the when I teach a little bit reading and writing, what I do find to be valuable is helping the students talk through what happens when they read, as well as talking through some of what happens when I read, as a way of understanding how to read. Honestly, like here are some things that can happen when you read. Here are some things that the book does to you when you read it, and here might be how it does those things or how it does that thing. And that to me seems like it has some maybe pedagogical value.
Oh, I think it has a lot of pedagogical value. I mean, sophistry had pedagogical value. Like sophistry, like I mean, play so hard on these sophists. Like these sophists were teaching people how to argue. Like they lived in a society where people had to argue like for a living in order to
Yeah, yeah,
participate
yeah, yeah,
in political life, in court cases. You had
yeah,
to be able to argue, you had to be able to express yourself well. Like that was the purpose of sophistry.
yeah. Like
The
law
purpose of
school
sophistry
is
was,
largely sophistry. Like law school
yeah,
is like legal history plus sophistry.
yeah, like the purpose of sophistry is not to tell you what to say or what to think, it's to teach you how to convince other people to agree with
Yeah,
you.
debate club. Yeah.
And I think like, English class is and you need something like it to teach people how to use the language well. And like all of these, tools for talking about and manipulating text, like I think it's a good way to teach people how to argue well for their point. I just think it can be a little bit damaging to literature. But on the other hand, it also preserves literature, right? Like that's literally,
Mm-hmm.
that's why the Iliad and the Odyssey were preserved, is because like they were used to teach people how to speak and write well in like Hellenic culture. Similarly, like all these texts, like, it gives them life to be taught, but then it also takes life
Mm-hmm.
away.
So like it seems like maybe the two honest benefits of literature classes are, on the one hand, they are an excuse and a mechanism for the preservation of literature. And on the other hand, they are a means of instructing young people in rhetoric and how to speak convincingly about thoughts. You think those are kind of the two honest benefits of lit classes?
Yeah.
Do you think there is a theoretical way to teach somebody who's not going to specialize in literature about reading and books that wouldn't be, because it seems like the price of doing things that way in your account, like those are the benefits, and then the cost is you take everybody, or many of the people who are not specialists, and you turn them off of serious literature for life. Do you think there's a better version theoretically?
Yeah, I do. I've read a few memoirs of various writers. I would say there are very few writers who would say that their education in school inspired them with a love of literature. Like like even Cicero would say that like, oh yeah, like what people get taught in school is like boring and dull, or like I think it's by private tutors. I don't you can don't quote me on Cicero, but like I remember reading Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday. It's about Vienna in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is astonishingly fertile. Like that's where Freud came from, like astonishingly fertile on a literary level.
Yeah.
And he was describing going to school, and he was like, it was so dull. It was just rote memorization. Like we all hated school. It's like these kids, would sit in school, and then they would like head to the cafes after school and discuss literature. And they really felt like literature didn't necessarily have anything to do with what they were learning in school. Similarly, like all this like Oxbridge education, this British public school education that everybody idealizes, like that too, was largely like they largely learned three books. They learned the Iliad, they learned the Aeneid, and then they learned Horace's Odes. And they would just like translate these books by rote for years, often doing them multiple times over. And so, like, I think whatever you teach in school is going to be a lot of people will have negative feelings towards that stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but I think you can teach people the skills that they'll need to read literature. Like I do like, and then they can like literature can be what they read, like what they read using those skills, but without necessarily associating it with school. Like
yeah.
I
Like
think
I don't,
like
yeah, like school doesn't need to be enjoyable, but it shouldn't be harmful, or it should be minimally
yeah, I
harmful.
think you could just minimize the amount of harm. Like I mean, like the way like especially like the English major is basically like all literature belongs to the English major. Like, does it really necessarily have to be that way? Like, can't there be like you just teach like a certain smaller number of texts? Like it's a bit much to like have like an English class like where they ruin science fiction novels and an English class where they ruin romance novels.
That's no, like, but no, that's kind of like because your argument is almost like shrink the canon instead of expand the canon, but like shrink it in order to save books from the canon is sort of like the suggestion, it seems like.
Yeah, like like I think like we can trust like a lot of books I we can trust that they will survive. Like like Moby Dick is a great example. Moby Dick is not really taught in school, but it survives. Because people genuinely enjoy it. If you taught Moby Dick regularly at school, like people would not. I don't think people would read it.
Do you think it is? So I don't know. I mean, this is the other thing about not being an English majors. I don't know the history of literary studies very well, but did it? I know that it was revived at like. I know it was not celebrated at the time. It was revived later, but like, did it go through a period of being treated as scholarly canon, or did, like?
Yeah, yeah. So Moby Dick is like really a creation of the scholars. Like the English professors, they really revived Moby Dick. They saw a lot of meaning in it. They wrote a lot about Moby Dick. They like really
Mm,
worked to get it reissued in editions that people could read. But it's quite hard to actually teach Moby Dick, you
yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah,
certainly at the high school level, it's hardly ever taught. Even nowadays, especially in college, like
yeah.
I mean, like it's a bit difficult to teach to undergrads. Um, so people will teach, maybe Billy Budd, um,
Right.
or Bartleby the Scrivener.
Bartleby, yeah,
But Moby Dick is it's a bit much. Like they'd be like, and then there are a lot of books that like that, like
yeah,
Ulysses,
yeah, yeah,
hardly ever
yeah.
taught. Even like a lot of relatively simpler books are hardly ever taught, like Middlemarch, David Copperfield. I was impressed. I was not an English major, so I was impressed when I like started looking into it and realizing like a lot of like these like really big classics don't hardly ever get taught. Um,
But no, but like I guess my question is like those books, you're saying they survive even without being sustained in the academy, but I'm wondering like are we experiencing their survival right now as a result of some previous eras of the like do you
I
think
think
their survival will
well, I think
be
we have to separate like the academy from being taught, right? Like I think like the academy sustains itself, like the professors make their careers off these books.
okay, oh,
Um,
right, right, like
but
research
they don't
versus teaching, yeah,
necessarily,
yeah,
and they like do a lot of work to sustain awareness of this book in their little like their guild.
yeah, yeah,
um and like do a lot of interpretations and close readings and historical analysis and all that stuff, but they don't necessarily teach them to
You
undergrads.
know what? This is like an interesting proposal because you're like one of the things you say in I forget which essay it's one of these essays you say that like English professors are there's a deformation that occurs where the professional deformation of becoming an English professor is that you feel possessive over your subject matter. You become very invested in creating a field of mystification under which you are a person with a privileged understanding of literature. And so as a result of that, you start scaring normal people off of literature. And then that ends up being self-defeating because English professors do sort of like the academy ultimately relies on some kind of implicit support from the larger population. But it seems like your suggestion then is that like scholars should definitely keep doing their research because like that's a lot
Oh,
of
yeah.
the like inarguable good is like doing big translations, providing historical context and commentary, like fixing up readable versions of texts that are older. Like these are all things that are like definitely, and like even making selections from older books that we like, saving books from the past that we might lose otherwise. All these are like really, really valuable services that scholars provide to readers broadly. But the suggestion seems to be that like professors should simply not teach their own specialties. Like you should be teaching something.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't
I
know.
don't know. I mean, like to be honest, like most of what I don't like is like how books get taught in high school. And then a bunch of people were like, well, how would you do it differently? I'm like, I don't know. I don't have any better proposals. I don't have any better proposals than teaching people to like write essays about what snow means in Ethan Frome.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, I'm like, everybody wants to tell teachers how to do their jobs, which I am not immune to, but like,
yeah.
like, I have no idea how to teach people how to read and write well. All I know is like a casualty of that is, and I do think like people who become English, well, I don't know, people who become English majors, they generally, love literature and they come out of their English major still loving literature. I do have observed quite comically that they often seem to be like, they don't really tend to like older books.
Yeah, you have a whole
Like
spiel about this. Yeah.
English majors like often feel like a bit like, dismissive of older books. Because I do think, like English majors often tend to be somewhat in awe of their professors. And like, your professor knows everything, every possible thing there is to know about, but it feels like everything. Like you remember Mary Jo at Hopkins, like it felt like she knew everything about poetry and there was no room for anybody
Yeah, I
to like
hadn't.
unless you knew every single possible thing about poetry, then you couldn't understand poetry. So it's kind of like,
Yeah, because I do want to talk. Like, you have an interesting passage about learning, or rather, not learning meter at Hopkins, and how you're
yeah.
learning it instead, which I think is like it's a wonderful story. It also, yeah, like like made me think about how the good and bad ways we try to teach meter. Like, I do think that you got you got recommended some textbooks. Like, go read these books, and remind me, were you? I thought you were a fiction person.
I was a fiction writer. Okay, so
Okay.
for context for your podcast
Yeah,
listeners,
yeah.
Hopkins MFA program, the writing seminars, where you and me both went. I was a fiction writer. Were you in poetry?
Poetry. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. The poetry side is like the American bastion of formalism. Like, right, like many of the professors believed that writing in meter and rhyme was a really good thing to do. At some point we took they combined fiction and poetry, I think after you were there,
Okay.
so that we would take a pedagogy class. And our pedagogy class was co-taught by a fiction professor and a poet. The poet was Mary Jo Salter,
Yeah.
who is wonderful. I have a lot of respect for her.
Yeah, yeah.
She compiles the Norton Anthology of Poetry, or at least she did for a
She
while.
does the 20th century and beyond.
And she really wanted us to write in meter. She wanted us to write sonnets.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I really wanted to be able to do that. And so I asked her for recommendations about books that could teach me about meter. She recommended me several books. One way I remember was by Alfred Korn. It was called The Poet's Heart Poem's Heartbeat. There
Yeah,
were
yeah,
several.
yeah.
I read these books. I just couldn't hear it. Like I couldn't. Like I
Yeah,
knew
yeah,
like a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
words about like what unstressed or stressed syllable is,
Yeah.
and like I learned basically learned like, oh, you can look up words online and like see where the stress falls in a word, and like I learned a lot of facts
Right.
about stress. But what I was not able to do was hear the stress or unstressed syllables. Like, even like, the word unstressed, like the first syllable is unstressed, the second syllable is stressed.
Yeah.
I
Though
could
that
not.
that one's a little more hovering. Like there's a little more variability with it. Like into is one where it can shift a little, and
Yeah.
unstressed can
There,
shift a little. Yeah.
yeah. And then but there, that is, it's like, it's also dependent on where it is in the, like that's the things I didn't understand is like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
pattern
yeah,
of
yeah.
stress and
It's not
unstressed, like really
absolute
depends on
value.
the whole
Yeah.
sentence and
Right.
like where everything. And then if you have like a metered poem, it starts off in meter, it'll tend to kind of force things into a certain stress pattern. Because like that's how people will say it. Anyway, a
Mhm.
lot of things I did not understand about stress, and I never really got them until, and I still could not get them in a way that I could teach another person
Sure.
about
Yeah.
stress or unstressed. But honestly, Mary Jo Salter also could not teach another person about stress or unstressed. What I did was at some point I got really into Chaucer, and I got really into Old English, no, Middle English,
Yeah.
and
No.
I started reading a Middle English version of Chaucer. And then I was like muttering Chaucer to myself, like wander prile shure shot, for 4 months. And after that, I was like, oh, like suddenly, like I could hear, stress and unstress. I'm like, oh, it's like that's why, like all these old poets who wrote in meter, they did not take classes in meter. They did not read textbooks in meter. They just lived a world where there was so much metered poetry. They read thousands and thousands of pages of it. That's how they knew it.
Like what's definitely true is you can't teach scansion on the page. You have to teach it aloud. I mean, in my I think you probably need both. Like ideally, you have visual and auditory,
I
not
guess,
necessarily
but don't you
both.
think like these ancient, well, I mean, like Old English poetry is like a little bit different, but it also like relies on like certain like stress patterns. Like the people who like
Oh
composed
yeah.
Beowulf, like they did not, they did not have a page. Like I
Oh
do
yeah.
think
No.
people just
Yeah. I mean, for thousands of years, poets were working only by ear. So I mean, then I think that the follow up question really is like you. I think you can teach meter, especially if you're doing it aloud. But if you are somebody who wants to write poetry and you love metrical poetry, you will learn how to write like the poetry you love, and like that's what poets have been doing forever. If you are not somebody who wants to write metrical poetry and you're not a prosodic scholar, is it helping you to teach you how to scan, or is it another version of this kind of
it's
like
not even a question
exercise
of
in
whether
torment?
it's not even a question whether it's helping or not. It's more like if I came to Mary Jo and wanted to know how to learn meter. She
Yeah.
wanted to teach me how to meter, and she recommended to me these books about meter,
Yeah.
but that was not the right thing to do,
No,
right?
that
Like,
wasn't the
the
right thing to
right
do,
thing
but I
to
don't think that
do
means
was
it's impossible to teach it.
to
I think that
read. The
I think
right
like
thing to do was
yeah,
to read like Paradise Lost aloud, like read like Chaucer aloud. Just read a lot of metered poetry aloud, and like that's really the way to get it.
it was funny. Your argument too was that because it reminded me like Pope has the line, he says someday Shakespeare will be as distant from us as Chaucer is, today. And like your suggestion was that the trouble with learning meter from Elizabethan poets is that they're not far enough away. That like
Yeah, yeah,
when you can't read Chaucer without forcing yourself to learn how to pronounce it because it's so alien. And so in a
yeah.
way, like you have to go through that exercise to think that consciously about pronunciation in order then to become aware of the sound in a way that's helpful. But yeah, I mean,
With Shakespeare, it's hard to
yeah,
tell if it doesn't, because there's the vowel shift, right? Like that is explicitly what the great vowel shift did. Is like it changes the sound, it changed the way that long vowels are pronounced.
though,
And
though,
like,
though I think like a lot of like I learned a lot of meter from performing Shakespeare, right?
yeah,
So like you do end up hearing it pretty well when you're having to perform it regularly because the meter also teaches you how to pronounce the words in many
yeah.
cases.
That's definitely
Um,
true. But I think like it is like Shakespeare doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't scan as well as Chaucer does.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah,
But
Shakespeare's
also
he
partially
also
on
yeah
purpose.
he plays with meter, but yeah, I mean Shakespeare scans pretty well.
No,
I mean, I would say
I
I
more
would
meant
sooner
like
I would
speaking.
sooner have you learn meter from Shakespeare than from Milton. I would say it would be my argument, but that's just because I don't like Milton's prosody. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just more meant like it's hard to tell with Shakespeare if something's like doesn't feel like it's scanning the best, if it's just because you're pronouncing it poorly or because it's like intentional. I don't know.
Yeah.
Shakespeare's great. I do feel like I learned a lot more from Chaucer. But I'm also generally just like a bit of a bigger Chaucer fan than Shakespeare fan. So
No, I mean,
um
yeah,
I I
there's
have
lots to
like a
love.
fondness. I just have a fondness for Chaucer because it's just I don't know, it's so much less flowery and it just feels a lot more down to earth and more fun. Anyway,
I won't, yeah, I won't pit Shakespeare against Chaucer, but no, I think like where I'm totally in agreement with you is like the best way to learn form, either as a reader or a writer, is through like lots of practice and reading a shit ton of good verse. Like that's the way to, and I think that like you make the point that like most of what literature can teach us is best learned by just reading a whole lot of it. I also wonder if to some extent, like I'm reminded of like there's the ongoing debate. I guess it's not ongoing anymore. The sort of recently resolved debate that still sort of has some controversy surrounding it about teaching reading in schools, and because there was a kind of a model of teaching reading that was, hey, just immerse, and they'll pick it up. And it turns out like, well, some people pick it up, not everybody does. I suspect that you may be better equipped to absorb osmotically than a lot of people, partly because you read so quickly.
it's
But I mean,
possible.
I tend to be very much with you in like loving lay reading. I maybe like in some cases I have a slightly more robust approach to lay reading, but I agree that like finding the hidden meaning is about the worst thing you can try to teach somebody to do when it comes to reading a book that's worth reading. Like it's a great way to teach someone to hate a book.
Honestly, the thing is, I'm temperamentally somewhat conservative. So like, I would prefer like nothing to change ever. Like, I would be quite. I feel like if the English departments and the way English is taught changed, I would be like at sea. You know, I mostly regard that what I, what because I didn't do an English major. I'm not in the academy. I mostly just regard what I do as like being quite separate. English professors also regard what I do as being quite separate. So we're
Yeah,
both on the
yeah,
same page with that. With regards to reading, yeah, like that was wild. I don't know, it was kind of wild. I do understand, like having read about that, like and thought about it. I'm like, oh yeah, like the way people read is not really phonics. Like we don't sound out words. We just look at the word and we know what it is. So I definitely understand people's perspective that we should teach people
yeah.
to read the way people actually read instead of using this whole other artificial method that has nothing to do with how people actually read. But it turns out that this other artificial method was the better method.
Yeah. I also think it's because my theory is that there are like four different things that people are doing, and they call all of those things reading, and it depends on what kind of mind you like, how your mind operates. Like I'm pretty sure that like I'm a bookish person. Like I read and write a lot, but I'm pretty sure that the thing I'm doing when I say I read is sort of a different mechanical function than for a lot of the smart bookish people I know, and that's probably why I'm so fucking slow at it. But I think
That's
for a
probably
lot
true.
of people who are not inclined to like books, those artificial means end up being very helpful. Because again, like we're not just raising a society of English professors, right? We're the same way that like there are plenty of things I learned how to do that I learned like in the kludgiest, clumsiest way possible because like I like like my like as a swimmer, like the goal of all of my swimming lessons as a kid was don't drown, right? And like that's what I achieved is I can not drown, for a while. That was the first part of my conversation with Naomi Kanakia. You can find her at her blog, Woman of Letters. There will be a link in the show notes to that. And I think she may be on Twitter and other places. I'll try to find links for those. But she's an extremely prolific and enjoyable read. And if nothing else, she'll point you toward some new things worth reading. So go check that out. And you can check out the Secret Show, where the second part of our conversation will be up in the next day or so. That's sleerickets.substack.com. Go put your email address in, and I'll give you a week's access for free. After that, it's pretty fucking cheap. I have one more. I'll mention this again in the front part of the show, but if you happen still to be listening, I am looking to speak with people who have experience studying under or working with Louise Glick. And I'm happy to have those conversations totally off the record. I'm just interested in talking to people who sort of knew her as students, as proteges. So if you have had any of that kind of experience and would be interested in talking, again, on or off the record, send me a note at sleerickets@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.